The Freedom Convoy of truckers is moving across the country and it's making its way to Ottawa. Now, the truckers and their supporters say this convoy is not just about the vaccine mandates, but about fighting for Canadians' freedoms. To discuss this in more detail is political reporter Brian Lilley. Now, Brian, we've had a few of these truckers on Bridge City News who are trying to send a clear message to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Trudeau was asked about the convoy. What was his response?
His response was to take what's a very serious issue in many ways, including how this vaccine mandate will result in supply chain shortages, everything from parts for manufacturers to the food upon your shelves, and turn it into these guys aren't vaccinated, and it's just angry truckers and angry conservatives. So he's taking a serious public policy issue and doing what he often does, turning it into a very partisan political issue for his own benefit. This is an issue that has been raised by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Retail Council of Canada, the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. I've talked to the head of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, who said that it's going to impact his membership in terms of being able to get parts back and forth across the country, because this was an issue before the vaccine mandate kicked in. Canada has been short about 23,000 truck drivers. And so to add on to that, we're taking about 18,000 of them out of circulation because they're not allowed to cross the border anymore. And you take a bad situation with a shortage of truckers and therefore a shortage of ability to move goods back and forth, and you just make it worse. And Trudeau is determined to use this as a political tool to say it's just about vaccinations, it's about angry conservatives, beat up on Aaron O'Toole, and show that to the many Canadians who are angry at anyone who isn't vaccinated, that he's on their side and all these other people are bad and they're prolonging the pandemic. That's his whole message about this. He doesn't see this as a serious issue.
What's interesting too, Brian, the truckers we've spoken to on Bridge City News say they are double vaxxed. The majority of the truckers heading to Ottawa are double vaxxed. It's more about fighting for our freedoms and lifting all of the mandates, getting back to normal. That's really what they're fighting for. So let me ask you something. Will any of the federal party leaders be meeting with the truckers once they hit Ottawa? How about Tory leader Aaron O'Toole?
He's had a lot of his caucus members expressing support, but he has been hesitant to say yes. And if you think back to the Yellow Vest protests that were going on a couple of years ago, you can understand why. Andrew Scheer, who's just today was expressing vocal support for the truckers and saying, look, it's leading to product shortages. When he was Conservative leader, he went out and he met with the Yellow Vesters, who had a lot of different issues going on. There was a big convoy. It met in Ottawa, people from across the country. I remember covering it. But Andrew Scheer spoke on the same day as a controversial figure. Now, he was on the steps of Parliament Hill. This figure was down the street several blocks away. It didn't matter. The media just piled on and said, you were speaking at the same rally as so-and-so. And it hounded him and it damaged him politically. So I know a lot of people want Aaron O'Toole to just say, well, to heck with it, and I'm going out there. He's got to be careful because he's got to look and see who shows up. What message are they bringing? If there's a bunch of people there with signs saying lynch the prime minister, he can't be out there seen with those people. If they're saying we need to arrest and jail Trudeau now, or hanging's too good for him, I've seen those messages from some people. They may be the fringe, but if they're out there in front as a political leader, you can't show up. And so I understand why O'Toole is doing that, based on past history and how radicals often try and overtake political movements.
Are any MPs willing to show up and meet with the truckers at this rally once they hit Ottawa?
I'm sure several of them will, but again, I think a lot of them will be looking out the windows and saying, okay, what signs are out there? Who's the leader? Because as I said, you can get painted, as Andrew Scheer all too well knows, you can get painted because some fringe elements show up. So a number of them are expressing their support. They are raising this issue. They're pointing out that this is a legitimate issue, but whether they meet with them will depend on the message that the leadership brings and the message that's out front with the signs. And that's just safe politics, because you can turn off an awful lot of people by allowing fringe elements to take over.
Brian, a woman from Medicine Hat here in Alberta set up a GoFundMe page that has raised more than $4 million for the truckers and the Freedom Convoy. But earlier this week, the company behind GoFundMe said they would not release any funds until a plan was in place to spend the money as promised. Some actually look at this as being political interference.
Well, the company would say no, and I kind of understand where they're coming from. Tamara Lish is her name. I think I'm pronouncing it right. Leach or Lish from Medicine Hat. And she's involved in the Maverick Party. Her family has owned a trucking business in the past. She's involved in music. She's involved in a lot of things. So very much a community leader. She set up the page. It has been far more successful than she ever dreamed. And if they'd raised $20,000 to $50,000 and they said, well, and they had a loose plan of here's how we're spending the money, I think GoFundMe would have released it. But they've raised more than $4 million now, Hal. Earlier today, I was checking, it was 4.2. I'm sure it's gone up because that's $500,000 more than yesterday afternoon when I looked. And so the company has, they have to look after their reputation and be able to say to people who come to them and say, well, I want to donate to this cause, that it's being handled right. So all they've asked Tamara to do is show us the plan of how the money will be dispersed, what it will be spent on. She has assured her followers that it is going to be spent properly, that she's working with the company. So she doesn't seem bothered. But again, I go back to she's got to be careful that she is not allowing the radical elements that will try and attach themselves to her and her very successful cause from damaging what has been a very successful fundraising effort and a very successful convoy. That's my advice to anyone in any new political movement. Watch who's attaching themselves to you, because your name and your reputation get damaged in the end, not the people who are on the fringe who no one will remember at the end of the day.
And she did mention as well that you'd be spending the money towards food, fuel, and lodgings for the truckers participating in the Freedom Convoy. And Brian, over 45,000 Canadians have now donated. And like you said, over $4 million. It's pretty incredible. Brian, I was shopping at my local grocery store here in southern Alberta, and I saw a number of empty shelves. I've had other friends send me pictures as well from different cities that they live in, including in Hamilton, Ontario, empty shelves at their local grocery store. But then other people have posted online, look, I've got full grocery store shelves here. Now, you've been speaking with people from various industries across the country. The debate is bizarre. What's the reality as you see it? Are we actually seeing a supply shortage here right now?
So yes, we are. How bad it is will depend on where you are. Now, I want to be clear. The supply chain shortage predated the vaccine mandates for truckers. It has been going on throughout the pandemic. You speak to anyone who deals with supply chain logistics, and they say it has been very stressful, tenuous at best on whether you get the goods that you ordered. And if you remember earlier in the pandemic, we did see a lot of products just simply not available, and it wasn't all due to hoarding. If you're a fan of a soft drink that isn't the most popular brand, you couldn't get it for a couple of months because they were only making Diet Pepsi and Real Pepsi and Coke and Diet Coke, and they weren't making their others. And so if you wanted something different, you couldn't get it. A lot of that had to do with supply chain issues. We saw before the mandate even took place, we saw the snowstorm down in Nova Scotia. It showed how fragile things are because for a couple of days there were empty shelves in many Atlantic Canadian grocery stores. We saw with the big snow dump, 50 centimeters in a day in Ontario. Last week, that the same thing happened. So last week it was probably the snowstorm. This week, we're starting to see the impact of the 23,000 truckers that were short, plus the 18,000 that can't cross the border, plus the Americans that aren't allowed to come this way because they've instituted their own mandate as well. So it goes both ways across the border. So it's a combination of all things. Trudeau's policy is not helping. I went out to 3 grocery stores just yesterday. I went out to a Metro, a Farm Boy, and a Loblaws. The Loblaws at Maple Leaf Gardens in downtown Toronto, Hal. The entire onion section gone. The potato section just about wiped out. I went through cooking oils, frozen food in some areas, juices. These were the things that were missing. At the Metro, it was meat, it was produce, it was oils and sauces again. So this is an ongoing issue. And anyone that wants to tell you it's not is playing politics. You can't blame it all on the mandate, but that doesn't help. It's a perfect storm right now. And that's why Trudeau needs to rethink his policy, because his policy is hurting rather than helping.
Many people would also argue the flooding in British Columbia impacted our food supply chain, and as well the drought that we had here, the nasty drought here in southern Alberta. Brian, a controversial subject has been Quebec's so-called anti-vax tax. Has it been implemented yet? And what are the polls saying? What do Canadians really think about this issue? Are they getting behind it?
Well, it's interesting. They are, and I'll get to those poll results and the number in a moment. But Quebec announced it, and then everyone said, "Look, there's been a big spike. They got 7,000 appointments in one day," and then it petered off. I've been following the Quebec numbers, and some days it's 2 to 4,000 people are getting their first vaccination, and that's of all ages, so including children 5 to 11 who only recently became eligible for it. Well, on next door in Ontario, they're regularly doing 9, 10, 11,000 and more per day without the threat of a vaccine, anti-vax tax, as we call it. So people think that these measures improve the situation, even when they don't. As I pointed out many times before, Quebec has had the most draconian measures throughout the pandemic, and they've had the worst results, whether it's by case count, by death count, however you want to look at it. They've had the worst results, but the most draconian measures. And yet the public is irritated. And so there've been a couple of polls showing majority support, between 52 and 60% support for an anti-vax tax. There was even one poll that showed, they said, well, how far would you go? And they kept increasing the penalties that people would face until they got to jailing the unvaccinated. And 27% of Canadians said, yeah, jail them. So that's how steep the divide is in the country. And I don't think politicians like Justin Trudeau or Francois Legault in Quebec are really helping the situation by further dividing and angering people and then using that for their own political gain, which is exactly what they're doing.
The Trudeau Liberals have advised Canadians in Ukraine to consider leaving as tensions flare with Russia over a potential invasion. Now, is Canada's position firmed up on the Ukraine-Russia dispute?
Well, it would appear to, though the Trudeau Liberals did have a bit of an own goal, or look silly, however you want to put it, over the weekend. They kept having cabinet ministers and caucus members hold up a sign saying, I stand with Ukraine, just on a piece of paper with hashtag I stand with Ukraine. Sorry, that will not leave Vladimir Putin shaking in his boots. That's just not going to happen. I'm not sure there's much Canada could do, but it's not a serious policy response. It's not a serious way to handle what is a very serious issue. Vladimir Putin is threatening Ukraine, and not just because NATO is considering protecting Ukraine or allowing it, but because he has an expansionist mindset. He wants to take what he thinks is his, and he doesn't think that Russia ever should have given up Ukraine, even though it was an independent country and it's an independent people for years, and there's a lot of ties to Canada. So the Trudeau Liberals have told Canadians to get out. They have said that they will consider offering small arms, and so small arms can be anything from pistols to rifles, and in that category, as opposed to heavy arms, which would be tanks, cannons, etc. They're looking at giving some supplies to the Ukrainians. They have offered, I believe it was $120 million loan to Ukraine. May as well consider it a gift. I'm not sure we'll ever get it back, but Ukraine is a country that we want to turn towards Western Europe. We want to turn towards the Western view, but there's a struggle within Ukraine, and they haven't figured out their own house yet. They haven't gotten their own house in order, and that's part of why Putin is trying to take advantage of it at the moment.
And south of the border, the Biden administration has promised Ukraine $200 million in weaponry as well, as the tensions continue to rise, like you said, with Russia. Now, speaking of guns, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau continues to push ahead on his gun control plan, even as more and more evidence, Brian, as you say, shows it's really not working. What's the latest?
Last week, Hal, I got a news release from the Toronto Police Service indicating that someone had a number of firearms and they were arrested, and these facing a number of charges over this. And I looked and I said, well, that's impossible. Justin Trudeau's banned that one. And he banned that one, and he banned that one. And of course, the handguns the guy had, they've been banned for decades. So how on earth did this happen? Didn't he get the memo? Unfortunately, we're dealing with another wave of shootings and murders in this city. Toronto's not alone in this. It's happened across the country. It's been going on for several years. Since about 2015, 16, it really started to rise. And the Trudeau administration, their entire viewpoint is, well, take more guns away from the people who passed the gun safety course, who submitted to having the RCMP do a thorough background check, including having their spouse or their intimate partner sign off on them, being allowed to have a gun. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but if you wanted to go and buy a gun, Hal, your wife would have to be consulted at the least. She could say, I don't want to say anything. She could say, no, I don't think it's a good idea. Or she could say, Hal's a great guy. He'll be fine as a gun owner. But they have to reach out and ask, do you want to speak to anyone's spouse? We have incredibly strict gun control in Canada already, but it's not on the people who are committing the crimes. A recent report out showed that the Canada Border Services Agency is not doing a good job of stopping guns coming across the border, and that's where we should be focused. Unfortunately, the Trudeau Liberals want to look at the easy target, and those are the people already following the law.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.